The 1920s felt like a reward, a decade of jazz, radios, automobiles, and a booming stock market. After surviving the trenches of World War I and the death toll of the Spanish flu, people were ready to live a little. But in October of 1929, everything changed. And what followed wasn't just a crash. It was the worst economic collapse in modern history. The US economy in the 1920s was booming, on the surface. New consumer goods, rising wages, and easy credit made life feel affordable, enjoyable, and modern. Households were filling up with newly available appliances like refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines, all symbols of a modern, brand new world lifestyle. In fact, 1922 saw the very first radio advertisement, marking the beginning of a consumer culture driven by marketing. But beneath it all, there were dangerous cracks starting to showing up. Rising inequality, overproduction in farming, and heavy dependence on industries like construction and automobiles. And as stock prices soared, millions jumped in, often on margin, borrowing money to invest in businesses they barely understood. By mid-1929, the economy was already slowing. Construction was falling, car sales were down, and prices began to fluctuate, showing early signs of instability. Still, investors continued to speculate, convinced the market would not only hold, but rise. In late September, the London Stock Exchange collapsed, a clear red flag. But American optimism remained unchecked, and speculation continued to fuel an ever bigger growing bubble. And although the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in order to cool down speculation, it instead managed only to choke off access to credit right when the economy needed it most. Then came the crash. October 24th, 28th, and 29th, Black Thursday, Monday, and Tuesday. On Black Thursday alone, Wall Street lost 11% of its value. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange, and inside, chaos reigned. Traders screamed, phones rang off the hook, and stock values plummeted by the minute. President Hoover tried to calm the nation with a radio address, assuring the public that the business of the country is sound. But Monday brought no relief. Then came Black Tuesday. The bell that opens the market was drowned by cries of "Sell, sell, sell" as panic set in. There were fistfights on the trading floor. Some traders fainted from exhaustion, others broke down in tears. Billions in stock value were wiped out. Margin calls forced more panic selling. Banks that had invested depositors' money in the market found their assets vanishing into thin air, and with them, public trust. In reality, only about 10% of Americans actually owned stocks. But over 90% of banks weren't just invested. They were actively speculating in the market using their clients' deposits. When Wall Street collapsed, thousands of these banks with little to no cash reserves lost their assets entirely, leaving depositors penniless and trust in the financial system shattered. Panic swept the nation. The psychological blow was immense. People had believed in unending prosperity, in the security of their banks, and the promise of American progress. That faith was now broken. As confidence evaporated, the panic became contagious, a financial pandemic. The crash wasn't contained, far from it. It rippled outward through banks, businesses, paychecks, and everyday lives. But the crash wasn't the cause. It was the spark. The economy was already in recession, and much of the devastation that followed stemmed from the complete lack of banking and economic safeguards at the time. There were no deposit guarantees, no federal safety nets, and almost no mechanisms for coordinated economic recovery. By mid-1930, the slide into chaos was well underway, and the end seemed nowhere in sight. What turned the recession into the Great Depression were the compounding factors that came next. Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, which worsened the global downturn as other struggling industrial nations retaliated with their own trade barriers. Gold standard constraints, which tied the hands of central banks and prevented the kind of stimulus the crisis demanded. Federal Reserve inaction, as it failed to inject liquidity or stabilize banks. Widespread bank runs and collapses that wiped out personal savings and brought lending to a standstill. Businesses collapse and mass unemployment that spiraled across sectors. Deflation kicked in and deepened the crisis even further. We often hear about the dangers of inflation, but deflation, the opposite, can be just as deadly. In the Great Depression, prices collapsed, and when prices fall, So do wages. People earn less, but still owe the same debts. Consumers delay spending, hoping for lower prices tomorrow. Businesses stop investing. It's a downward spiral. And in the 1930s, it helped freeze the economy in place. Instead of public relief, the president offered lectures on self-reliance. Millions of Americans had already been pushed into economic despair, and as businesses failed, unemployment soared, wages plummeted, and many cities could no longer collect enough in property taxes to pay their teachers or police. Public servants were laid off, and vital services broke down. Soon enough, bread lines stretched around city blocks, and makeshift shanty towns sprang up on the outskirts of the cities. Jobless men wandered city streets in search of anything. Private charities tried to help, but the need far outpaced their resources. The most vulnerable, children, the elderly, women, and minorities, suffered disproportionately. Children dropped out of school to help their families survive. For millions, daily life meant hunger, cold, and uncertainty. As hardship deepened, unrest grew. Across farming communities, angry groups blockaded roads and protested falling prices. In cities, the despair spilled over into demonstrations and violent clashes. Racial tensions intensified too, as competition for scarce jobs fed resentment and discrimination. Contrary to popular belief, rural Americans often suffered more than their urban counterparts. The prosperity farmers had enjoyed during World War I quickly faded, and by 1929, food prices had collapsed. While cities had soup kitchens and some public relief, rural areas were isolated, under-resourced, and deeply affected by falling commodity prices. As if a financial collapse wasn't enough, nature delivered another blow. A terrible drought, one of the worst in U.S. history, ravaged the Great Plains, lasting nearly a decade. Combined with relentless heat waves and powerful winds, the land was left dry, cracked, and barren. These extreme conditions stripped away topsoil, turned once fertile farms into dust bowls, and compounded the misery for farming families. Farmers who had overplowed the land now watched it blow away. Dust storms darkened the skies, livestock died, and crops failed. Over 2.5 million people fled the region, many walking or driving away from their ruined farms, chasing the dream of a better future. Oklahoma was especially hard hit, and together with displaced families from other parts of the Great Plains, they came to be known as Okies, a poignant symbol of the American breadbasket turned to dust. The suffering during the journey and upon arrival in California was captured forever in photographs by Dorothea Lange, whose haunting images told a silent story to the world. President Herbert Hoover initially called on Americans to tighten their belts and work harder, urging businesses to maintain operations in hopes that the economy would naturally recover. But as the crisis deepened and recovery failed to materialize, he did take some action, though he remained firmly opposed to direct federal aid for individuals. Hoover was not indifferent to the widespread suffering. He even declined his presidential salary. Still, he believed that government handouts would undermine the nation's self-reliance and moral fiber. The public, however, saw things differently and let him know in pointed, symbolic ways. Hoovervilles sprang up across the country, makeshift shanty towns built by the homeless on the outskirts of cities. Hoover blankets referred bitterly to old newspapers used by the destitute for warmth, and Hoover flags were empty trouser pockets turned inside out to show poverty. Hoover's name became shorthand for hardship, a grim national joke during one of America's darkest economic hours. By 1933, the toll was staggering. 9,000 banks failed, over 750,000 farms lost to foreclosure. U.S. GDP shrank by nearly 30%, 1 in 4 Americans unemployed, over 200,000 children roaming the country on their own, often without parents or guardians. These weren't just numbers. They were families, livelihoods, futures, erased. But while this era is often defined by turmoil, despair, and shocking realities, it also revealed a different side of the American spirit. Ordinary people stepped in to help one another however they could, sharing food, opening their homes, and volunteering time and resources. A cultural shift emerged, a renewed understanding of the importance of community, of shared well-being, and of valuing the nation's collective health over individual gain. The Great Depression wasn't caused by one thing. It was a perfect storm of inequality, speculation, policy failure, environmental disaster, and political paralysis. It began with hope and ended with hardship. And the lessons it taught still shape how we respond to crisis today.